Professor, very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you. It's good to be here.
Professor, tell us more. I mean, Henry Matisse is part of high school as well as tertiary institutions' art curriculum. But why only now are we seeing an exhibition dedicated to his works?
It's a good question. You know, Matisse is probably one of the most important modern artists after Picasso, as you mentioned in your introduction. And although we have seen some Matisse works in Johannesburg previously, in fact, 3 of the works on the exhibition are from the collection of the Johannesburg Art Gallery, but there's never been a full-scale exhibition devoted to Matisse. And I suppose it's partly because Johannesburg isn't really on the kind of circuit of these big international exhibitions. Although the Standard Bank Gallery has previously hosted exhibitions of work by Chagall, of Miro, Picasso 10 years ago, and now, at last, an exhibition of works by Matisse.
Professor, I mean, for those who are not really familiar with Henry Matisse, what are some of the key characteristics of his works?
Matisse really came to prominence in the early 20th century as someone who reinvigorated painting. So he was instrumental in the development of modern art, in liberating form and colour, and really bringing a whole new sense of what it is to paint. So in that sense, truly one of the most significant figures in Western art history. And then he continued throughout his life, a very long life and very prolific career, continued to work in various media. And then towards the end of his life, in the late 1940s, he started working in paper cutout and turning that into a medium in its own right. So he's really celebrated for being someone who pushed boundaries, who in many ways was, you know, at the forefront of inventing modern art and therefore informing contemporary art, I suppose. So it's difficult to overstate his importance in Western art history.
Let's extend on that point of pushing boundaries, Professor. I mean, Matisse's life works were filled with influential women, but why were women and nude such a key theme in many of his works?
Matisse loved women. I think, you know, it must be said. And, you know, he had his wife in the early years was very important in his life and his work. She was the model for many of the most important works that he did in the early 20th century. Then also his daughter Marguerite was very important to him. And throughout his life he had various models and assistants and people who worked very closely with him, who were mostly women. So he really loved the sensuality. You know, his work is very sensual, it's very decorative. And so, in fact, he continues this kind of tradition of the female nude, which was a very important aspect always has been in Western art making, as being a kind of a vehicle for the expression of sensuality and beauty and so on. And so he brings that into the 20th century, and he overlays it with this kind of sense of exoticism and a sense of luxury and a sense of beauty. But it must also be said that these relationships with these models were always above board. But his biographers always at pain to point out, well, you know, these were never erotic relationships. They were, you know, in fact, Matisse famously said about his models, he said, you know, if I buy a bowl of oysters to paint a still life, I don't eat them.
I see, Prof. Well, on that point, I mean, there were many exceptional artists in the same period as Matisse, but I mean, why has he remained one of the most popular artists of his time?
I think that has to do with the fact that his work is very accessible. It's often very colourful. It is very decorative. It engages. Yeah, exactly. It's very sensual. And he also engaged subjects that weren't particularly problematic or difficult or controversial. So there's an aspect, you know, the work is very accessible. It's easy to like. I think that's part of it, but also the fact that he has such phenomenal mastery. So I think the great thing about this exhibition is that it gives people a chance in Johannesburg to be able to go and experience it firsthand and really to see what an incredible master of line and form he was. And so this idea of rhythm and meaning, you know, the exhibition is about exploring the various rhythms and meanings that animate his work.
Professor, speaking of first-hand experience, do tell us about some of the key items that are in the exhibition. I mean, we are fortunate enough to see here, we'll be seeing it on screen, to see one of his first and last drawings.
Yes, absolutely. I think this is what is interesting about this exhibition, is that it was curated specifically for Johannesburg. So this exhibition's never appeared in this form before and will never appear in this form again. And there are some works that are really, really unusual in that they don't travel very much. you'd have to go to the Matisse Museum in the north of France to see them. So we have some of the very earliest so-called Fauvist paintings that he did. This was a movement at the beginning of the 20th century. The Fauves, or the wild beasts, as they were called. They really shook up the art world, and Matisse was key amongst them. So we have some of those very early works. And then we also have some of the very last works did. We have one of the two last paintings that he ever did in 1951. He painted two, and he never painted again after that, and he died in 1954. So
no auctions taking place.
No, sadly. But so it's interesting, that we have some of the very earliest and some of the very latest, and then a full range of the various kinds of media and themes and things that preoccupied him throughout his career in between.
I'd certainly love to come and see. But Professor, do tell us, how did the African continent actually inspire Matisse's works, and can we see some of these at the exhibition?
Yes, absolutely. Matisse, like many of his contemporaries, like Picasso and various other people, in the early 20th century discovered African art, very much in inverted commas, but discovered it in the sense that they started looking at it with fresh eyes and not seeing it as kind of just purely anthropological objects, but objects that had a very specific and compelling visual language. And they started incorporating aspects of that into their art making in an attempt to revive Western art making, to create the sort of new language that we now call modernism. And Matisse was key amongst these artists. He collected many objects. He was a very eclectic and wide-ranging collector. He had a substantial collection of African objects, Western and Central African masks and sculptures, as well as textiles. He collected a large number of textiles from North Africa, and particularly the kind of applique and cut work that is so much part of North African textile traditions. And those works, or these objects, or what he could take from them, would often find their way into his work. But whether directly or indirectly, you would always see this kind of sense, yes, of the African as an important animating influence in his work.
He should have painted some African women, that's what I'm saying. Professor, you did mention earlier on that this is, of course, the final week of the exhibition. What has the response been like to the exhibition so far?
The response has been really positive. We've had thousands of visitors, which is great for an exhibition in Johannesburg. Art exhibitions, I think people tend to think they're very specialised, only for people in the know. So it's great that we've had such large visitor numbers. There's been an enormously positive response in the press and from visitors. And we've also had an amazing educational outreach program, which has taken workbooks that we designed, taken them out to schools in far-lying areas that might not necessarily be able to come to the exhibition.
And how do people participate? How do they get to the exhibition, Prof?
Well, it's at the Standard Bank Gallery in Johannesburg. The exhibition is free, which is also fantastic.
That's
normally, if
amazing.
you go to these exhibitions elsewhere in the world, you've got to pay lots of money to get it. So it's a free exhibition. It's open every day except Sunday. So weekdays from 9 to 5, I think, and Saturdays from 9 to 4.
Professor.
Also, it's today and next Saturday.
Saturday.
Yeah.
Awesome stuff. Well, good luck, Prof. Hopefully I can come through and have a look at some of those works. Thank you so much. That was South African curator as well as Executive Dean at the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Federico Freschi. And he was joining us to talk to us about that exhibition. Marumo Kekana will be back with your sports news shortly after this break.